All right, so our next group of macromolecules are the lipids. And these are the only group that aren't going to have monomers and dimers and polymers. So lipids don't actually have true polymers. Instead, what we have is lipids being divided into 3 different types of groups. And we'll go through each of these, but those are fats, phospholipids, and then steroids. And the reason that all 3 of these are grouped together as lipids, not because they're polymers or they look similar or anything, is because they are all hydrophobic, which means they are nonpolar. And they are hydrophobic because they have long carbon-hydrogen chains. So lipids mostly consist of hydrocarbon regions. They have a few regions with some other molecules like oxygen, but those are relatively small compared to their large structures that are generally nonpolar hydrocarbon regions. And so this property puts them all together as most similar to each other. All of the other groups, the carbs, the proteins, and nucleic acids, are all going to be mostly polar molecules. So let's start with fats. And if you think about what kind of foods do you eat that contain fat, you're probably going to come up with things like butter and olive oil. Most oils are all fats. So sugar is a refined carbohydrate. Oils are just a refined fat. This is actually a highly processed food. Peanut butter. Those are all very fatty foods. There's also very healthy foods that have a lot of fat. Avocado is a very fatty fruit. So fat molecules are made up of 2 different types of molecules. Again, this is not repeated units to make a big polymer. Instead, what they're made up of is a glycerol and a fatty acid. You can see that down here. The gray box here is the glycerol. And then there is 1, 2, 3 fatty acid chains. So these are fatty acids. The glycerol has 3 carbons with some hydroxyl groups. So you can see there's some oxygens over here. And then the fatty acid region, this is the largest portion of the fat molecule. And it consists of a carboxyl. So you can see that carboxyl here, which is going to bond to the glycerol. And then they have these long carbon chains. And sometimes these are the same, sometimes they're different lengths. The different carbon chains are going to determine the 2 different types of fat that you're eating. As with all of these groups, we have a type of covalent bond. And so in fats, we call this covalent bond the ester linkage. And you can see that in red here, the ester linkage between the glycerol and the fatty acid chains. So each fat molecule would have 3 of these ester linkages. So you've probably heard of things like saturated and unsaturated fats, or maybe quote unquote healthy versus unhealthy fats. So let's talk about the difference. What does it mean to be saturated? So if I took you outside and sprayed you with a hose, which I won't do, but you would be saturated with water. So saturated is to be like fully covered in or full of. And in this case, we're talking about being saturated with hydrogen. So in a saturated fat, they have the maximum number of hydrogen possible, and there's no double bonds. So if you look at this, all of these carbons are single bonded to each other, and then at each carbon we have the maximum number of hydrogens possible. So you can see all of the gray hydrogens that are attached to this molecule. Saturated fats tend to be very straight, so they have these zigzag structures and they compact well together. So you can see how 3 straight lines would be easy to put them together, and so they end up being solid at room temperature. So think about any fats that are actually solid at room temperature, so things like butter, peanut butter, those kinds of things are going to be high in saturated fat. There's this thinking that maybe coconut oil was actually really good for you, and it's typically not. Coconut oil is very high in saturated fat. If you leave it at room temperature, it will actually solidify, and you have to heat it up to get it to be an oily. These are generally associated with high risk of heart disease. So other sources of saturated fat, as well as trans fats are even worse for your heart, are animal products, so like meats and cheeses, things like that, have high levels of saturated and trans fat. Unsaturated fats are generally termed healthy. However, they do still have a lot of calories. So fats generally have 9 calories per gram, and I'm little c calories here, in comparison to carbs and proteins, which only have 4 calories per gram. So despite being healthier, they can still have you put on a lot of weight if you eat a lot of fats. Unsaturated fats are no longer fully saturated with hydrogens. So what's happened is there's been a double bond that's formed, and one of the hydrogens or 2 of the hydrogens have been removed. So we're looking at cis double bonds. So you can see there's a cis double bond right here. There's only one hydrogen attached to each of those carbons instead of 2. And so this is not completely saturated. And so you can see how this gives this molecule this bent shape. And when a saturated fat is bent like this, it takes up more physical space. And so you can't compact these molecules closely together as you could a saturated fat. And so these tend to be typically liquid. So the more saturated fat something has, the more solid it's going to be. The more unsaturated fat, the more towards liquid it's going to be. If you've ever gone to the grocery store and bought like a Greenwise organic peanut butter, you'll notice that when you open it, it's got a film of liquid on the top. And that's because peanut butter in its natural state is more unsaturated. And so what we do is we actually bombard it with hydrogens called hydrogenation or hydrogenated. And that turns it into more saturated, which makes it nice and creamy and the way that we like to spread it on bread. So what's the point of fats? The biggest function of fat is energy storage. Again, they can store 9 calories per gram, which is more than twice of the amount of calories in a gram of carbohydrates or a gram of protein. And so having fat in your diet, on your body, is a great way to store lots of energy. Having excess fat can be detrimental to your health. So these are our long-term food reserves. So if we were to go through periods of starvation, which is what we do when we try to lose weight, put ourselves in a calorie deficit, is that your body starts to pull its fat stores out, and that's how you actually lose weight. Fat has other important functions though. So it's also used for cushioning vital organs and insulating the body. So you have fat not just underneath your skin, but near all of your vital organs. You have fat around the heart, fat around the liver, fat around all the internal organs that helps to prevent friction and helps to insulate your body. Again, too much fat around your internal organs can cause major problems. There's a type of brown fat, which is really common in infants, and this is highly metabolically active. And so brown fat is actually used to produce thermal energy and heat in babies who are just born and need that to help them regulate their body temperatures. All right, the second type of lipid are the phospholipids. And phospholipids have a very different structure where they don't have 3 fatty acid chains. What they do is they actually have 2 fatty acid chains, one here, and then they have a hydrophilic head. So these molecules actually have 2 different regions. This region down here is nonpolar and does not mix well with water. But this region up here is polar. You can see the phosphate group here where they get their name from. They've got lots of oxygens here. There's a nitrogen. This is polar. So this is going to mix well with water. The term for this type of molecule is called amphipathic. Amphi means both. And so they have both a polar and a nonpolar region. But because this nonpolar region is so important and prominent, it still gets grouped as a phospholipid because they have this large hydrocarbon fatty acid tail. So if you take a whole bunch of phospholipids and put them in some water, they end up organizing themselves into a double layer called a bilayer. And this is each molecule orienting itself to the water in the best way possible. So there's water out here and water in here. This whole region is non-polar. And so what happens is the hydrophilic heads orient themselves toward the water, and the hydrophilic tails orient themselves away from the water. And so it creates this buffer zone, which is hydrophobic. And this is actually how we form the membranes that create the boundary between the cell and the external environment. So this would be outside of the cell, this would be inside of the cell, and then this is the cell membrane. So in order for something to pass from the inside or the outside of the cell, it has to be able to go through this hydrophobic nonpolar buffer region. So you can see these proteins that are embedded here. This protein is inside of the cell, so it must be polar. This protein is embedded in the membrane, so it must have a non-polar region to orient with this non-polar area that doesn't have any water in it. The third and final group of lipids are steroids. And steroids are characterized by their structure. So now instead of fatty acid chains, we have rings. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon rings. There's 3 of these have 6 carbons, and then one of them has 5 carbons. And then there's different functional groups off of these. So if you look, this is actually a molecule of cholesterol, which is the precursor to a lot of our different hormones. And we've already seen a few steroids when we talked about functional group. We had estrogen and testosterone. So these are necessary in our body. Cholesterol is also found in membranes. So this is hydrophobic, so this can sit inside of a membrane around our cell, and it's used to help our membranes maintain their structure and fluidity. However, a diet very high in cholesterol, as in fatty acids that deposit cholesterol, can leave excess cholesterol in the arteries. So when an artery has cholesterol in it, this is an artery, blood is supposed to flow through it, cholesterol can get embedded in the artery wall. And then what happens is instead of this artery being slick and smooth for the movement of blood, it gets kind of sticky and it starts to recruit even more and more cholesterol. And so eventually you build up blockages. And when this happens in the heart, it can lead to myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. When this happens in the brain, this can lead to a stroke. The most recent dietary recommendations for 2020 to 2025 actually recommended eating a diet in as low of cholesterol as possible. Plant foods actually don't contain any cholesterol. The only cholesterol that would come through a diet would be from animal products like dairy and meat. So here is an overview of the lipids. So you can see it doesn't have a specific monomer or polymer. Instead, what we have are the 3 different examples. We have our fats, our phospholipids, and our steroids. So I want you to know the structures of all of these, as well as the different functions. For fats, you should know the difference between saturated versus unsaturated. And then again, the thing missing from here, the covalent bond of lipids is called the ester linkage.